just wanted to continue talking about some of the design movements. Art Nouveau is what you're looking at, and I think we talked about it a little bit in the design lecture, but Art Nouveau was described as the new art, and it was an attempt to create a truly new form of art that did not mimic the past. It manifested in different ways throughout Europe and the US, and it really began in France. And artists like Henri Toulouse-Lautrec would create these amazing posters. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, often made these women look like beautiful fairies, and he accentuated the hair, and there was ornate frames and hand-drawn text in the Art Nouveau movement. It was very organic. So you see these sinuous lines, whiplash curves, organic flowing shapes, things like peacock feathers, women's hair were stressed. And this movement really influenced art, architecture, interior design, furniture, applied arts, and graphic work. And it began in the late 1800s and ended around the time of World War I. And it really was part of industrial production in the sense that these posters were printed, they were put up, people looked at them, became inspired by them. Often they were torn off the walls of buildings because people were so excited by this new movement. Art Nouveau kind of ended as Cubism and Surrealism were beginning. And I'm going to jump to the next movement here that's a little different. I'm going to kind of go out of order and start looking at some of the psychedelic art. And the reason I want to show you this is because I want to show you these kind of direct links to psychedelic art from the Art Nouveau style. And often the psychedelic artists would just take imagery from Art Nouveau and kind of paste it in. So some of the same features are present in this movement as were in the Art Nouveau movement. The hand-drawn text, you can kind of see that. This kind of organic sensibility. There's a real stress on positive and negative space. Unlike Art Nouveau, this movement was extremely political, and there was a lot going on in society at the time. Geographically, this movement began in San Francisco, Bay Area, and it was really a protest to some of the politics of the time. We were getting involved in Vietnam at the time. The Vietnam War had started. There was a sense that people wanted to break away from the rigidity of the 50s and really kind of protest what was considered normal in society. And this movement was really inspired by these psychedelic experiences connected to LSD usage and other drugs. And so you see these kind of kaleidoscope swirling patterns. It's often described as both political and spiritual, and it was really kind of the counterculture of the time. Fantastic, metaphysical, and surrealistic subject matter was often part of this movement. The morphing of objects and themes, repetition of motifs, innovative typography and hand lettering, and this idea that this psychedelic altered state of consciousness could inspire us to see things a little bit differently. And it was a big source of artistic inspiration. So kind of continuing here, we're going to jump back and we're going to look at Dada, which Dada, happened after Art Nouveau, and it was kind of part of, World War I. It started in 1916 and kind of continued through until 1923, and it was a response to war and what was happening to society at the time. And it wasn't just a design movement. There were artists, writers, intellectuals involved in this movement. And what happened was many of these people grew very frustrated with what was happening in society because of the war. And a lot of them moved to Switzerland, and because of this, they all kind of came together in Zurich. And they really wanted to protest things like nationalism. They wanted to protest what they saw as kind of a really constrained culture. And they really thought that society had no meaning, that society was kind of bankrupt, and they considered themselves non-artists, and they really wanted to create this anti-art and break from these traditional norms. Dada means hobby horse in French and baby talk in English, and the one rule is there are no rules. It became an international movement and dissolved in the early 1920s. It's whimsical, sarcastic, witty, intellectual. It really influenced movements like Surrealism. And the kind of interesting thing is it self-destructed when it was in danger of becoming acceptable. And even though the Dada art is nonsensical, the creators and the artists and intellectuals and writers that were part of it were very serious people talking about serious issues with this movement. And you can see there's kind of a collage, a lot of collage, use of photography and text. So kind of next, we're going to go into Russian constructivism, also a very political movement. And in this movement, there was this idea that art should be practical, but used for social purposes. And it should express the experience of modern life. And the constructivism artists in Russia at that time believed that art should serve society. And this movement was really part of the political group. The Bolshevik Revolution was part of this movement. The October Revolution in 1917 was, part of this movement. And the social needs and values of the communist order were important to this movement. So early developers used photo montage, and this text, you can see this kind of bold sans serif text that's kind of indicative of the movement. Often there's, a stress on common things like clocks. You can see bottles here. You can see people, ordinary workers are often part of the visuals. And the idea was that they really wanted to construct this new society, this new social order. It really influenced movements like Bauhaus, and many of the Russian constructivist artists later would immigrate to Germany and teach at the Bauhaus school. This movement kind of declined in the 1920s, and it was partly due to kind of the Bolsheviks' hostility toward avant-garde art. And so even though it started out as a very kind of social, political movement, it kind of declined because of the constrictions and the oppression that began to occur in the 1920s in Russia. Okay, so we're going to kind of jump into the Swiss style here, also called the International Typographic Style or International Style. This movement originated in Switzerland in 1940, and it was inspired and really developed the design of the mid-20th century. Some of the defining characteristics: legibility, use of the grid, objectivity, sans serif type, Helvetica. Often there was a kind of asymmetrical layout, and the combination of type and photography was really common in this movement. And posters were really celebrated in this movement and seen as kind of an effective means of communication. So we're going to talk about the grid system, and there is another lecture you'll look at just on the grid. But what is the grid? A grid is really a guide to divide content and format into columns and margins. So often designers and artists use a grid, either a 1-column grid, a 2-column grid, or a 4-column grid. And grids become really critical, especially when we're looking at multi-page design, where there's a real need to create visual flow and consistency. And so as you start to design, you'll see that the more text you have, the more challenging design can be. And grids really help organize this information. Almost all major publications use a grid, and it's really so that there's consistency, you can read text, and there's a real visual consistency that occurs with grid design. Some major influential designers were part of the Swiss style were Joseph Müller-Brockmann, and I really encourage you to look at some of his work. So we're going to end the lecture with typographic deconstruction, which I have a little video of David Carson for you to watch. But many designers in the early 1980s were exposed to critical theory. And typographic deconstruction was actually kind of a break away from the more rigid grid-based design style that occurred with the Swiss style. And there was kind of this move in the 1980s to go away from functional form and perfect balance. Innovative designers like David Carson really would use image and text in ways that had never been considered before. Text bled off the edge, and there was this idea that legibility was not as important, and that really it was about communicating kind of the concept or the underlying concept behind the design. So here's just a few images you can look at for typographic deconstruction. Neville Brody was also really critical and part of this movement. You can see a lot of his innovative design work, especially with the Macromedia campaign. Here's one of his images. So Emigre magazine, Ray Gun magazine, two important publications for you to kind of look at and see. And I'll end this lecture with a David Carson design where you can kind of see some of his innovative type here. So hand-drawn type, use of photography, often type bled to the edge or off the space altogether. David Carson, interesting enough, was a surfer, and he had never really been formally trained as a designer, but he got a job at a magazine in the late 80s, or mid 80s to late 80s, and he started to create these really innovative designs. And so he became part of Ray Gun, actually. And one thing he really thought about design was that you should never focus too much on readability. You should think about the content behind the work and try and express it in a visual way. And he's considered really the father of grunge. So we'll be looking at more of his work.